Howdy. Howdy. As I came in this evening, I met my new friend Zach from Alaska, and he told me that was how I should greet you. But I'm delighted to be here, and thank you so much for coming tonight. My special thanks must go to Richard Box and Davis Ford, who introduced me to your wonderful university, and without whom I would not be here tonight, to Tyson and Christy Vocal, to Charles Schwartz and Dr. Frank Ashley, and Dean Mark Welsh, who made this visit possible, and to Lauren Zashevek, who has made all the arrangements, which have been quite difficult. Tonight I'm going to try and tell you a little bit of what it was like to grow up with the most famous man in the world. When ears were deaf and tongues were mute, you told of doom to come. When others fingered on the flute, you thundered on the drum. When armies marched and cities burned, and all you said came true, those who had mocked your warnings turned, almost too late, to you. Then doubt gave way to firm belief, and through 5 cruel years, you gave us glory in our grief and laughter through our tears. When final honors are bestowed and last accounts are done, then shall we know how much was owed by all the world to one. That is how millions of people, both here in America and in Britain, and throughout the free world, regarded Winston Churchill in 1945. People often ask me, what is my favorite memory of my grandfather? For me, that's an impossible question because I have so many. But I only knew one of my grandfathers, so I quite naturally thought that every grandfather was exactly the same as him. I never gave it a lot of thought, but if I'd had to describe a grandfather, he would have been a loving and much-loved man, puffing a large cigar, with everyone, secretaries, colleagues, family, and friends, all running around trying to make his life as easy and comfortable as possible. A man with endless knowledge and many interests, who recited poetry, made people laugh, loved animals, and loved walking around his garden at Chartwell, his house in Kent. And above all, he really loved painting. It was his passion. One day, a present arrived for me. It was quite big and badly wrapped and had a card attached to it, which said, "Please look after him, your loving grandpapa." I was about 5. In a fever of excitement, I tore off the paper, and inside I found a life-size toy bulldog. He was a magnificent creature with wheels in his paws. When I pulled him along, his head moved from side to side. I was enchanted, but puzzled. And I asked my mother, why had I got a present? And she said, someone gave him to Grandpapa, and he thought you might like him. I did. But even more puzzled I was, because why would anyone send a toy dog to a grown man when he had a real live dog of his own? She then explained that during the war, he'd been known as the Great British Bulldog. I went to bed that night and pondered on what she'd told me. The next morning, I set off for school on a mission. I asked all my friends, I said, my grandfather's a bulldog. What sort of dog is yours? No one said their grandfather was a Chihuahua. As I grew up, by observing how people behaved when they were with him and how they spoke about him, little by little it dawned on me that people thought there was something very special about my mother's father, with whom I spent a lot of time when I was growing up. The first 21 years of my life are full of recollections in which he played a part. Whatever the mood, my abiding memory is of warmth, affection, and humor. When he was a child, the young Winston, with his brother Jack, in the charge of their nanny, Mrs. Everest, used to spend long periods of their school holidays with their grandparents, the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough, at Blenheim Palace. the ancestral home of the Churchill family, and the place of Winston's birth. My brother and sister and I had similar holidays, albeit on a smaller scale. Anyone who's been to Blenheim will know that it's impossible to do something not on a smaller scale than Blenheim. So Blenheim is absolutely vast. It's not Versailles, but it's absolutely enormous. We would spend our holidays either at Chequers, which is the official country house of the British Prime Minister, like your Camp David, or at Chartwell, my grandparents' house in Kent. Like him, we were always accompanied by our wonderful nanny. Churchill described his nanny, Mrs. Everest, like this. He said, "My nurse was my confidant. It was to her I poured out all my many troubles." When he grew up, his parents were not what you could call attentive. His mother had a very, very hectic social life, and his father a very busy political life. And he described his mother, Jenny Jerome, who was born in Brooklyn. He said, "She shone for me like a fairy princess. It was for her. I loved her dearly, but at a distance." And that was the story of his childhood. So Mrs. Everest was the greatest influence on him for the first 20 years of his life. If that young American girl had chosen a different woman to be her son's nanny, history could have been very different. When Mrs. Everest died in 1894, my grandfather said, "I lost my dearest and most intimate friend for the whole of the 20 years that I had lived." Probably, as a direct relationship of his relationship with her, he had a great affinity for my nanny. I'm sure she brought back happy memories of his old friend. Both of these strong-minded and upright women would have laid down their lives for their charges without a second's hesitation. During the war, any discussion of defeat in our house was taboo. But that did not stop my nanny thinking and planning. Convinced, no doubt with good reason, that if Hitler invaded Britain, his first target would be the entire Churchill family, Nanny knew she must be ready. Most people have an image of Winston Churchill. On the 10th of May 1940, standing on the steps of 10 Downing Street, with a cigar in one hand, making a V sign with the other, with snowy white hair and not a lot of it. But what most people don't realize is that he was born with bright red hair. My brother and sister and I had all inherited his red hair. What on earth was Nanny going to do when she was trying to escape with 3 carrot-top children? She decided she would dye our hair black and take us to live with her parents in Liverpool, where they had a pub. Fortunately, she didn't have to put this plan into action. If she had, I'm sure she would have succeeded, and we would probably have become pretty good at pulling the pints. One day, when London was being heavily bombed, and our parents were away, and she was convinced that the house was going to be hit, she called 10 Downing Street, and within minutes, an armoured car was there to drive us to Chequers. When we got there, the Prime Minister was waiting at the top of the steps and greeted us with the words, "Poor little shelter brats." Of course, he was referring to the fact that if the bombs had fallen anywhere near us, we'd have had to go to either the air raid shelters or the underground. Visits to Chequers in the early 50s, when my grandfather was Prime Minister for the second time, I remember very well. The war had been over for 6 years, and I had never known life without rationing for food or clothes. In my grandparents' house, there was no Victorian policy of the children being seen and not heard, or only speaking when they were spoken to. As soon as we could sit in a proper chair and use a knife and fork, we were at the dining room table, regardless of the company. The first Christmas I remember was at Chequers. Hollywood could not have done better than my grandmother. She was a perfectionist in everything that she did. We had the tallest tree, the biggest turkey, and hundreds of beautifully wrapped presents set out in family groups around the Great Hall. We had carols and tea parties, and Father Christmas in the shape of either my uncles or my father. We were such dim children, we never recognized them. We had carols and tea parties, and crowds who gathered to wish us well at Christmas, on Christmas Day, and everything was absolutely lovely. While we celebrated, the country still had to be run. A team of secretaries in attendance at all times, pens poised, ready to take dictation from the Prime Minister, dressed in his siren suit. His siren suit was something that he designed himself. When the war started and he knew he was going to get out of bed, when the air raid sirens went off, and he thought how difficult it would be to put on all these formal clothes, he decided he was going to invent a garment that would be easy to get into. And I think we can safely say that he was the inventor of the jumpsuit. He had this, what he called his siren suit, which had lovely zip up, and there's a wonderful newsreel of him on the White House lawn demonstrating his siren suit to the press. And he had them in tweed, in grey flannel, in pinstripes. And for the evening, he had jewel-coloured velvet ones, dark green, dark blue, and burgundy, with velvet slippers to match with his monogram in gold. He loved dressing up. But these family occasions were interspersed with grand events, which, whenever possible, we children were included. It was the coronation we watched from a balcony in Whitehall, the excitement when our grandparents' carriage came along and he waved his hat out of the window, and it wasn't any old hat, it was some glorious creation which went with one of his uniforms. And we leant over the balcony and screamed for joy. We thought he was going to fall out of the carriage, and he thought we were going to fall out of the balcony. But we all lived to fight another day. Then there was his installation as a Knight of the Garter at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. There he was able to enjoy dressing up again. He loved fancy dress. He had a long, dark blue velvet cloak and a wonderful big velvet hat. It was like a big beret with ostrich feathers. He loved that. Then there was the lying in state of Queen Mary, the grandmother of our Queen. My sister and I were placed in a window just under Big Ben so we could see the procession of the coffin coming in to Westminster Hall, where a few years later he would lie in state. The next morning there was a photograph in the paper of two little girls, our heads just above the coffin, roaring with laughter. No one had told us that we shouldn't smile or laugh, and it was a good lesson, though, not to smile on a solemn occasion when there's a camera around. Now, of course, there's a camera in everyone's pocket, so you'll always get caught out. My grandfather's 80th birthday was a cause for considerable concern in the family. Some of you may have seen this episode in The Crown. For some reason, they seemed to devote nearly a whole episode to this story. I thought that was a bit excessive. But the problem was the portrait had been commissioned by the Houses of Parliament as a present to him, and he assumed that they intended to give pleasure. But I'd recently discovered that the man who was in charge of the committee to choose the artist was not a Churchill fan. And the rumor was out that it was less than flattering. I remember my parents discussing how on earth he was going to react. But whatever the concern, no one was prepared for the painting when it was unveiled. To a horrified gasp from the audience, the recipient observed, with a wry smile and characteristic humor, that is a remarkable example of modern art. My grandmother knew what she was going to do with it. She immediately sent it to Chartwell, their house in Kent, and asked the gardener to burn it. Once he was out of office, family life centered on Chartwell, the place that Churchill liked the best. He believed a day away from Chartwell was a day wasted. One day, in 1922, when my grandmother had just had her 5th baby and was recovering in bed, he gathered the other children up in the car and drove 19 miles out of London to show them this house and the grounds. When they'd run around to look at it and been in and out of the house, he asked them, "Do you like it?" He said, "We love it. Can we have it?" He said, "Yes, I've bought it." So he'd bought it, but the hitch was he hadn't told his wife and she'd never seen it. She never had quite the same affection for Churchill as he did, and she was seriously worried that with his extravagant tastes that he was going to put them in dire financial straits, which indeed he did. But he loved Churchill. After the war, the only people in the world who took Winston Churchill completely for granted were his grandchildren. Even his children were in awe of him. They had lived through the 30s, which he called his wilderness years, when he was out of office, out of favour, and telling the whole world what Hitler was doing in Germany, and the world wouldn't listen. People had said that the World War I was the war to end all wars, but he knew differently. And he had people coming to Churchill from Europe, from Germany, to tell him exactly what was going on. And he had people coming from the government ministries in London telling him how ill-prepared we were. So he was very prepared, but no one was prepared to listen to him. But it was at Churchill that we found him most relaxed. I used to love going to visit him in the morning, where he'd be having his breakfast in bed, with Rufus, his poodle, running around, the newspapers strewn on the bed, the cat snuggled up by his side, and Toby the budgerigar swooping in to share the breakfast. Once he was up, we would go for a walk. Accompanied by Rufus, our first stop would be to feed the fish in the ponds that he had made himself, one of his extremely extravagant ideas, that he'd made ponds and waterfalls all coming down, cascading down the hill to a lake below. So he'd throw the food into the fish, and they'd come up to feed. And he'd always turn to us and say, "You see, they know me." We tried it ourselves and discovered they knew us too. Grandpapa's birthday on the 30th of November was a command performance. We all wanted to be there. Every year there was a magnificent cake, always with a theme. There was champagne sparkling in the glasses and the aroma of good Havana cigars. Cigars were, of course, the obvious present. I used to go every year with my grandmother to the cigar shop to choose a cigar for him. They would lay out an array of cigars, and I honestly thought that I was making a choice. I afterwards discovered they were all identical. But the excitement of that year, he chose to smoke my cigar on his birthday, and I could sit on his knee as he puffed away. My abiding memories of him are at the dining room table at Churchill, where we would gather for elegant and sumptuous meals, every one of which was an occasion. Dressed as usual in his velvet Siren Suit, he was at his happiest, surrounded by as many members of his family as possible. He was determined, because he'd had rather a bleak childhood, that he would have a cozy, loving family relationship himself. And he indeed did everything that he could to make it that way. He loved his family, he loved his animals, and he loved all animals. He used to say, "Dogs look up to us, cats look down on us, but pigs treat us as equals." I do like pigs, he used to say. But the man who would win the Nobel Prize for Literature couldn't think of anything more original to say to the pigs as he scratched their backs than "oink, oink." But at Churchill, while my grandmother made sure that the food was perfect, he was not content until everyone's glass was filled with champagne, his favourite, Paul Roger. As a result of his taste for the good things in life, it is on occasion suggested that Winston Churchill consumed more alcohol and smoked more cigars than was good for him. I don't think there's any doubt about that. On one occasion, he was in the House of Commons, and the Labour MP, Bessie Braddock, came up to him. He said, "Winston, you're drunk." And he said, "Madam, you are ugly. Tomorrow morning, I shall be sober, but you will still be ugly." No one ever told me they saw him seriously the worse off for drink, but there's no doubt that he liked to have a glass of very weak whiskey and soda, a tall glass, with him at all times, and a cigar. These were his props. He had to have them whatever he was doing, even when he was painting. The glass remained untouched for long periods of time, and the cigar spent a lot of time what he called dead in the ashtray, except when he went out of the house, the last thing he did, he had a cigar lit, because that was his trademark. He was expected to be puffing away. On one occasion, he said, "I've taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me." He had a keen taste for both champagne and war. And with his mind on that, he once said, "I could not live without champagne. In victory, I deserve it. In defeat, I need it." In the spring of 1959, we were all having lunch at Chartwell when he asked my mother if she and I would like to accompany him on the Onassis yacht that summer. A few weeks later, I was not yet 16, after I'd been equipped with what seemed like a bridal trousseau, we boarded the Christina in Monte Carlo to embark on the most glamorous holiday imaginable. As we sailed out of the harbour towards France, Italy, Greece, and Turkey, the guest list could have come straight out of the pages of an Agatha Christie novel. It was the multi-millionaire shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis with his beautiful young wife, Tina, and their 2 young children, Christina and Alexander, all 4 members of these family, a few years later, independently, each of the other, would come to tragic ends. There was my grandfather, my grandmother Clementine, my mother Diana, and me, and the Churchillian entourage, private secretary, his wife, a bodyguard, a valet, and a lady's maid. And the other guests were the opera singer Maria Callas and her very boring husband. He used to wear white shoes, which had been cleaned with the stuff we used to put on our sports shoes, you know, that white powdery stuff. And he used to play footy under the dining room table. And you'd be able to see who he'd been sitting next to, because you looked at the women's shoes and you'd see who'd got white shoes on. The scene was set for an idyllic holiday on the most luxurious yacht in glittering company. Ari and Tina Onassis were the most attentive hosts. Maria Callas, the most irritating guest. Irritating, that is, to all save one. My grandfather once observed, "We are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm." And it was naturally and generally assumed that, as always, the attention of the world's press would be focused on the glowworm. But Callas had not thought of this, and jealous at having to share the limelight, she decided to hire her own team of paparazzi and have them meet us at every stop to photograph her as near to Churchill as she could. One day we arrived in the magnificent amphitheatre at Epidaurus, and she was thrilled to see a huge, huge mountain of flowers in the middle. And she turned to my mother and she said, "Oh, Diana, what beautiful flowers, but please tell me, why are they in the shape of a V?" I'll never forget the look of fury on her face when my mother replied, "Because, Maria, they're not for you, they're for Papa." By this time, it was not just Callas's spoilt and ill-mannered behavior which concerned everyone. She couldn't be happy with anything. If the air conditioner was on, she wanted it off. If it was off, she wanted it on. If the stabilizer was down, she wanted them up. If they were up, she wanted them down. Nothing could be right. But day by day, it was increasingly clear that a romance was being acted out in front of our eyes. All the grown-ups were terribly worried. I was enchanted. I was having the most wonderful time. I was watching the sort of behavior that I could only read about in the magazines that were considered unsuitable. Onassis and Callas had embarked on one of the most famous love affairs of the century, At the end of the cruise, both marriages would be over. But for the time being, the show had to go on. And go on it did. France, Italy, Greece, the Bosphorus, and the Dardanelles at dead of night, in case my grandfather was upset by memories of World War I. This was the first of my wonderful holidays with my grandfather. I just happened to be an available grandchild of an appropriate age to accompany him to the south of France over the next few years. There I had my first taste of grand hotels, in fact of any hotels, because after the war, not only was food and clothes rationed, but also money was. So you couldn't take money out of the country, so it was quite difficult to have a holiday. But there I'd find my bath was run, my clothes unpacked, and there was always someone hanging around longing to do something for me. I'd hate it now, but then I thought it was absolutely wonderful and decided I'd like to spend a lot of time being pampered in this way in the future. Unsurprisingly, hotels, however good, have never quite lived up to those early experiences. These were essentially painting holidays in the warmth of the Mediterranean sun, and travelling with Winston Churchill in no way prepared me for the hurly-burly of modern travel. We would drive right up to the aeroplane in our car, which, as well as the passengers, contained the canvases, the easels, and the paints, all the necessary elements of the days ahead. It was only later, when I travelled on my own, that I realised that the normal announcement of no pipes or cigars was changed to no pipes to allow him to puff away on his Havana cigar. I don't believe it would have made any difference to him, because during the war, when he was flying in unpressurized aircraft, he was told he had to wear an oxygen mask. He agreed on condition that they adapted it so that he could smoke his cigar at the same time. A posse of French police outriders would escort us from Nice to the border of Monaco, where, with a precision usually associated with the Brigade of Guards, they would change places with the Monegasque police. After this ceremonial arrival, we would settle down to a time of quiet and peaceful companionship, painting trips, drives, and picnics. For me, it was all lovely, but the very best thing was that just for a few days, I would have to myself the grandfather the whole world thought they owned. Ever since he got his first pocket money at the age of 7, my grandfather had experienced a lifetime during which his expenses always exceeded his income. Therefore, he was most understanding about money. It's funny that someone who couldn't manage their own books was made Chancellor of the Exchequer. But he would always ask me when I went to say goodbye, "Are you all right for money?" And I'd always say, yes, I was. And he'd always reach into his bedside drawer and draw out a wad of notes. As he pressed them into my hand, I would imagine that this was the result of a midnight flit to the casino, which he could reach from the lobby of the Hotel de Paris in Monte Carlo, and a secret passage under the square, which rose up in the casino so no one knew he'd gone there. He started painting at the age of 40, when he was very depressed after the disaster of the Dardanelles in World War I, and he picked up one of his children's paint boxes and decided to play around with it, and was hooked. From that moment on, wherever he went, he would take his paints with him. By the time he died, he'd painted more than 500 pictures. The only time he didn't take his paints was in World War II, during which time he only painted one picture. That was when he hijacked President Roosevelt from the Casablanca conference. You imagine the consternation. He was meant to be flying back the next day, and my grandfather persuaded him to go with him to Marrakesh, and all the arrangements had to be changed. And they drove across the desert, had a picnic in the middle of the desert, and arrived in Marrakesh as the sun was going down on the Atlas Mountains. 2 Marines carried the president up the top of the tower and placed him on a divan which had silk cushions on it. He was enchanted, and he was with my grandfather to see what my grandfather called the loveliest spot in the whole world. But as the president lay back, he looked up at his friend and he said, "I feel like a sultan. You may kiss my hand, my dear." Anyway, this was my grandfather liked to share the things that he loved with the people he liked. That painting was sold. With the painting he painted the next day, did the painting after the president had gone to the airport. My grandfather took him to the airport, still wearing his dressing gown, which was embroidered in dragons, so they clearly had a very relaxed relationship. And after he'd seen him off, he went back up the tower and painted the view that they'd seen. He gave that picture to the president, and that was sold 3 or 4 years ago to Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie for $2.5 million. I hope they're not going to cut it in half. I was with him when he put the last brushstroke onto one of his final paintings, a dazzling still life of oranges and lemons, an enduring memory of Mediterranean holidays. Whenever I look at it, I hope that he's fulfilling his desire for the afterlife. He wrote, "When I get to heaven, I want to spend a considerable portion of the first 1,000,000 years painting and get to the bottom of the subject." I hope he's up there on his cloud painting away. My friends were always welcomed by my grandparents at Chartwell. After a leisurely day of croquet and tea on the lawn, we would sit down to the usual sumptuous dinner. After the coffee, my grandmother would always catch the eyes of the ladies and say, "Shall we leave the men to their brandy and cigars?" On one occasion, I was there with a friend of mine. There were just 4 of us for dinner. I was about 18, and I think he was 21. And I hadn't thought to tell him that this was going to happen. So when my grandmother did her usual trick, he went ashen white. He realized at 21 years old, he was going to have his first brandy and his first cigar with the most famous man in the world. It all turned out wonderfully well because it transpired he'd just finished his military service in my grandfather's old regiment, so they had lots to talk about. One day in the summer of 1962, the peace was shattered when he fell and broke his hip in the Hotel de Paris in Monte Carlo. I walked to the hospital. I was just on holiday with him, with his secretary, Anthony Montague Brown. There were just the 3 of us there. Anthony and I walked down the street to the hospital, which was not far from the hotel. And Anthony said, "You know, Celia, you better prepare yourself. I don't believe he's going to make it." When we got to the hospital, he was looking incredibly frail in his bed and surrounded by more doctors and nurses than you could imagine could have fitted into the room. They were obviously all come on a sightseeing tour to see this famous patient. He looked around the room and summoned the strength to dismiss them all and turned to Anthony and he said, "Anthony, I want to die in England. You'll make that happen, won't you?" He didn't get an immediate answer. So he said, "Promise me, Anthony." And Anthony said, "I promise." As we walked back to the hotel, Anthony said, "Celia, I don't think that's a promise I'm going to be able to keep." But he made a call to Downing Street, and the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, ordered an RAF VC-10 ambulance plane to come and collect him. The next morning, he was put on a stretcher bed and wheeled onto the lift that takes the food up to the aeroplane and put in the stripped-down body of the aircraft. I sat on a chair next to him, and all I could do was hold his hand and hope and pray that he would make it. When we got to Heathrow, he was again put on the lift, and as it went down, there was a little group of airport workers standing by the ambulance that was waiting for him. They all looked ashen white and totally distraught. I mean, normally people would say "good old Winnie" and clap and cheer, but they were absolutely silent. And he seemed to get a burst of adrenaline. He looked and he smiled. He gave them a V sign. They clapped. We knew he was going to be all right. He was all right, but never quite the same again. Life continued at a slower pace. We made one visit to France together, but otherwise his time was spent between Chartwell in Kent and the London house near Hyde Park. I'm sure any of us here who are old enough to remember will know exactly where you were on the day that President Kennedy died. I was alone with my grandfather. We were having dinner in the London house, and suddenly a television was placed upon the table. and we watched as the story unfolded and history was made before our eyes. Tears poured down my grandfather's cheeks when the news came in that the young president was dead. And again, as we watched, his beautiful young wife, still dressed in her pink blood-stained suit, watching the swearing in of the new president on Air Force One. They seemed young to everyone, but imagine how young they must have seemed to that man approaching his 90th year. On the 30th of November 1949, his 75th birthday, my grandfather was speaking in London at the Mansion House, and he said, "I am ready to meet my maker. Whether my maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter." 15 years later, we celebrated his 90th birthday. The unspoken thought around the table that meeting could not be long delayed. 6 weeks later, he had a massive stroke, and it was clear that the inevitable was about to happen. The country braced itself, the family prepared for the end. The patient slumbered on, his faithful marmalade cat snuggled up at his side. This went on for 10 long days, and every day when I went to visit, that cat was in exactly the same position. A few years before, he had predicted that he would die on the same date as his father had died. Early on the morning of the 24th of January, 1965, we gathered round his bed to say goodbye. 70 years to the day, and pretty much to the minute since his father, Lord Randolph, had died, Winston Churchill slipped imperceptibly away to meet his maker. The machinery of state began to put into action the arrangements for the state funeral that the Queen had ordered some years before, and which had been called Operation Hope Not. The whole country was in shock. This was no tragedy. He was more than ready to go, but it seemed to affect everybody, young and old alike. People came from far and wide and to file past the catafalque in Westminster Hall. It was a freezing cold January, and it was so moving. They were all beautifully dressed in their best clothes, queuing for hours and hours and hours along the embankment, across the bridges, to file past the catafalque in Westminster Hall. Then they lined the streets for the state funeral 5 days later. The men of the family walked behind the coffin, and the women rode in the Queen's carriages. My Aunt Sarah had the very best words to describe that extraordinary day and the journey from Westminster to St. Paul's Cathedral. This is what she wrote. Now we were nearing St. Paul's Cathedral. I remember seeing it silhouetted in flames from the roof of the Savoy, standing by my father's side all those years ago. We had been told it was not necessary to curtsy to the Queen and her family. They were already in their seats. For the first time in English history, the monarch waved the precedent and waited for her humble servant. He loved Chartwell. At one time, both he and my mother had planned to be buried there, near his poodles, Rufus I and Rufus II. But one day, a few years earlier, the idea came to him to return to his birthplace. He had survived almost a century, and his thoughts as he wandered around Blenheim that day must have been all-embracing. For he decided to commit his bones to the earth, where his beloved father and mother and brother Jack awaited him. The battle hymn of the Republic crashed around the great cathedral as the bombs had crashed around it in 1940. Ghosts, they only live in our desire. It is perhaps our memories that see the mist hover over the lake and fireflies dance where no human could. He is gone. A barge did come and carry him on. The steel cranes bowed their heads. The gull grey sky held, and the Thames ran softly on. He is gone. What is mortal of him lies at Blaydon. After all the pomp and ceremony of the state funeral, the faithful servant who had served 6 monarchs, was restored to his family by the side of the Thames. And there he began his last journey up the river to Waterloo Station, with the cranes along the dockside dipping their heads in salute. That was the only unscripted part of the day. The crane drivers had come out of their own accord. We buried him at Blaydon in a tiny country churchyard next to his parents and in view of Blenheim Palace, where he had been born 90 years and so many adventures before. The first 21 years of my life were spent growing up with my grandfather. I've spent the years since with him in a very different way. I've travelled through the letters and the diaries of his early years. I've retraced his footsteps and sometimes his hoofprints through the forests of Cuba, where he rode with the Spanish forces against the Cuban guerrillas. I've travelled all over South Africa, reliving his thrilling adventures in the Anglo-Boer War. In Morocco, where he insisted on taking President Roosevelt to see the sun going down on the Atlas Mountains, and of course to the United States, the birthplace of his mother, which he called my other country. I've learned much about the man who, on becoming Prime Minister, said, "I felt as though I were walking with destiny, that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial." I've been reminded of his belief in his own destiny. When he was 23 and a soldier in India, he wrote to his mother and said, "Bullets mean nothing to me. I have faith in my star that I'm intended to do something in the world." His courage, both physical and moral, have been in constant evidence. His power of communication and his wicked sense of humour. It's been said that Hitler could make you believe that he could do anything, but that Churchill could make you believe that you could do anything. Without pomposity, his wit dealt with the tricky sort of situation in which leaders sometimes find themselves. He was sitting out in the margins of a wartime conference at the White House when an inebriated GI put his head round the door and said, "Hey, fatso, where's the John?" The Prime Minister, who he presumably hadn't recognized, said, "Turn left in the corridor and you'll find a door marked gentleman, but don't let that deter you." Churchill showed how wit and humour are a useful part of the armour of everyday life. On one occasion in the House of Commons, an opposing speaker noticed that Churchill was apparently dozing. And he said, "Must you fall asleep when I am speaking?" Which Churchill replied, without opening his eyes, "No, it is purely voluntary." The first British woman Member of Parliament was Nancy Astor, an American, and she and my grandfather did not get on at all. One day she said, "Winston, if you were my husband, I would put poison in your coffee." And he immediately replied, "And if you were my wife, I would drink it." In 1930, he decided to go on a long journey around North America and started off on the Canadian Pacific Railway, going right across Canada to Vancouver. He dropped down the west coast, ending up at Richmond, Virginia. And there he was staying at the governor's mansion. And this story I got, it was the oldest story from the youngest witness, from the lovely Harry Bird Jr., who only died a few years ago. But his father, Harry Bird Sr., was the governor. And my friend Harry Bird was 14 years old in 1930, and he was a fly on the wall for my grandfather's visit. The governor loved my grandfather. The governor's lady did not. My grandfather, I don't think, was a very good guest. And as they say, guests and fish stink after 3 days. Where he stayed 10 long days. He wanted to do all the battlefields and everything else. And Mrs. Bird was very upset because he wanted meal times. He liked to eat what he called tummy time, which wasn't necessarily the same time that other people did. And he asked to change some of the menus. And worse than anything, apparently, he was running around upstairs in his underwear. That she didn't like at all. But they gave a state banquet for him, and chicken was on the menu. And when the butler got to my grandfather and offered him the dish, he said, which bit of the bird would he like? He said he would like the breast. The lady sitting next to him said, Mr. Churchill, in this country we say white meat or dark meat. The next morning she got a posy of flowers and the card read, please attach this to your white meat. What would have happened if Winston Churchill had not been called upon to lead his country in its darkest hour? Without him, who, in the words of President Kennedy, on making him an honorary citizen of the United States of America, would have mobilized the English language and sent it into battle? Who else could have offered blood, toil, tears, and sweat to such effect? Without Winston Churchill, the world we live in would be a very different place. I'm going to end with my Aunt Sarah again, because she had a good way with words. And this is her final tribute to her father and to the man I'm proud to have called Grandpapa. Forgive me if I do not cry the day you die. The simplest reason that I know you said you'd rather have it so, and that I held my head high, remembering the love and glory that we knew. Forgive me if I do not cry the day you die. Forgive me if I do. Thank you very much.
So I'm just going to ask you a few questions myself, and then we'll take questions from the audience on the card. So if you have a question you wish to ask, please write it down, and then I'll go through them. What was your grandfather's view of the United States? I know he, one of the few Americans, a few Brits or few foreigners who was named an honorary citizen. You told me it was Lafayette?
Lafayette was the first one, yes, and his heirs and successors were also made honorary citizens. Unfortunately, I didn't get that. I'd like that. No, he came to America first in 1895 and didn't think he was going to like it at all. And he arrived in New York planning to spend 1.5 days there and was so enchanted he stayed for 10. He was on his way to Cuba to see his first real fighting. And he had the most wonderful time. And I think people think the special relationship started in 1941 with Churchill and Roosevelt. But I didn't think that at all. I think it actually, it started when Randolph Churchill met Jenny Jerome in the Isle of Wight on the Prince of Wales's yacht in 1873. And within 3 days they were engaged. And to the horror of both their families, my great-grandmother's family thought that it was no good. Their beautiful daughter was all right to marry the son of a duke, but not the younger son of a duke. That wasn't good enough. And the Marlboroughs thought that he was going to be a brash American, and so the father, and so that wouldn't do. They weren't keen, but they both got married in any event. And but he loved America. He really was passionate about it, and he couldn't. Nothing. I think the fact that he was half American made him a much more rounded being. And he didn't talk like those upper-class English people did in those days. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat.
There have been a number of books that have come out in the last 5 or 10 years about the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yes. They had met, but not really met properly some years before. But my grandfather, when he realized war was coming, he started to communicate with Roosevelt before he was Prime Minister. So when he became Prime Minister, he didn't have to start from scratch. And he had a great respect for him. And he knew that the president actually wanted to join with Britain in the war, but he knew he couldn't unless he could get Congress's approval. But I think that Roosevelt did everything he could without actually joining up. And I think they had a mutual respect for each other. Mrs. Roosevelt wasn't so keen on my grandfather, who she thought was a terrible influence on her husband. Too much drinking, too much smoking, too much staying up late at night. But they overcame that, I think. But anyway, he really, and when Roosevelt died, I mean, he was shattered. But of course, he had all the conferences where he was watching the president literally failing in front of his eyes. I mean, he was getting so ill. And then Stalin was taking advantage of him. And Stalin was a big bully. And so he decided to take advantage of the sick president and sideline my grandfather. So this was really difficult for him because his friend was sick and ill. Of course, it would never be allowed now, but that was what was happening. And he was distressed. He was deeply distressed when he died. I mean, there were stories about how he was at the memorial service for the president, tears pouring down his face. And but you know, I think it was a good friendship and it was a good relationship. And probably if there'd been a different president, it would have been a different story.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, the American president, 20th century American president, closest to your grandfather in terms of their character and the fact they're Renaissance men, both were is Theodore Roosevelt, not Franklin Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was a brilliant writer, a historian. He had written, I think, 24 books. He wrote the preeminent work for a century on the War of 1812 was done by Theodore when he was a young man. He was a hunter, he was a military officer, as your grandfather was. I think your grandfather was a colonel in World War I after he resigned as the First Lord of the Admiralty. So he's in the trenches.
He was in the trenches, yes.
Trenches. So, but they met once, and apparently they did not get along. Neither of them liked each other, probably because they were so similar.
Probably, yes.
Yeah. How did you start writing? Because you've written now 5 books? And we, Texas A&M Press published a couple
That's
of
right,
them.
they did, yes, absolutely. No, well, I started writing completely by chance. I had my last child very late in life and decided I had 2 young children and that I dropped out for 5 years to play babies. Right out in Devon, which is right in the west of England, and nothing happens there. And had the most heavenly time. But children grow older, and as my daughter became 5 and went to school, I had to think, what am I going to do now? And it so happened I went to have tea with my grandfather's nephew, who was a good friend of mine. And sitting on the table, there was a battered tin trunk. And, I mean, it looked extraordinary. So on cue, I said, what's that? And so he said, let's have a look. And so he opened it, and inside there were my grandfather's childhood letters, and there were diaries for my great-grandmother, and all sorts of wonderful things, and the invitation from the Prince of Wales for my great-grandparents when they got engaged, and all of that sort of thing. And I was enchanted. I said, this is marvelous. Without a thought in the world, I said, someone should do something with it. He said, yes, you do it, and handed it over. I went home, and I rang up my sister and I said, I'm going to write a book. Do you know a publisher? She said, yes, you do too. You know Nicholas at Heinemann. So this man was the head of Heinemann, and so I rang him up and I said, Nicholas, I want to write a book. Can I come and see you? This was a Tuesday. He said, well, yes, you better come quickly because I'm retiring on Friday. So I tried, and I stayed up all night, tried to put something together, not having a clue what you're meant to do if you're presenting a book presentation. And I went to see him on Thursday. On Friday, he signed his last contract. And I was on my way. And I had such a good time because the official biographer, Martin Gilbert, had asked for the Churchill archives all to be closed until he finished the biography. No one could get in, but I could get in. So I was able to do all my research with these touching letters, childhood letters with ink blots and tear stains, absolutely amazing. So it was very exciting. And then one thing led to another, and then I wrote, the next book was on his time in South Africa, which was the one I enjoyed the most, because that was just so much fun, so exciting.
So there have been dozens of biographies of Churchill over the years.
I think hundreds.
Hundreds. Hundreds. So Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, wrote one. It's not really a long biography, but it's a book about Churchill's character and his leadership style and all that, which my wife got for me for Christmas, I think, a couple of years ago. And the latest book that came out is I bought it. It's 1,000 pages long by
It's
Andrew
very readable,
Roberts.
though,
Yeah,
very readable.
Yeah.
I think Boris's book is an interesting book. It's quite different. He takes you on a journey. I don't know whether you read it, did you?
I've read half of it now. It's very interesting.
But it takes you on a sort of journey. And I think it makes my grandfather accessible to people who might not have read books about him. And that's always a good thing.
Martin Gilbert wrote the preeminent work, but it's hard to read.
Oh, my goodness me, Ned. I mean, if you had, the biographies, they take that much room on your bookshelf. And then there are about 2 companion volumes for each one. And no, but I mean, it's a valuable book of reference, I think, but difficult to read. And then, of course, there was William Manchester, who wrote very readable, not always accurate, but very good books. And now Andrew Roberts, which is very good, and that is very readable, I must say.
So what did you think of the book? I mean, the movie that just came out a couple of years ago with Gary Oldman.
Darkest Hour.
Darkest Hour.
I thought it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I thought it was a wonderful way of showing this rather complicated story of how my grandfather became Prime Minister and what happened in those terrible days. And I mean, I think it was absolutely extraordinary.
We had John Lukacs speak at the Bush School some years ago before I began teaching there. And Lukacs is one of the great historians of World War II. So I think he wrote about 20 books on it. And one of his books, which I've read 3 or 4 times, is the first 5 days of Winston Churchill's prime ministership at the beginning of the war. And the storyline in the movie is based on the book, although there is, as you know, there are some literary or cinematographic exaggerations in the movie.
But it isn't a documentary.
No, it's not a documentary. Winston Churchill did not go in the underground, and but he did have a some people said almost a mystical connection to the British people, which is what allowed him to lead the country in the war.
I think I put that largely to the fact of his American background. He was much more all-embracing, and he really related to people and animals.
Yes, animals. There's a part of the 3rd Manchester book on Churchill, which I guess he didn't finish because he died, and another author, a journalist, finished the book. But the story is that Churchill would get up very early in the morning during the Blitz, and the cloud, the smoke would rise, and Churchill would be standing there in the middle of the smoke, in the middle of all the smoke rising. Of course, the TV cameras were there, the photographers, and he'd have a cigar and his cane. And those pictures were very memorable. I mean, they're still in the archives.
No, it was always there on the bomb sites, seeing what had happened.
Yeah, and that connected him to the poorer people in the city and the British society, not just the aristocracy.
And he'd be there, tears pouring down his face.
Yes, he would. That's right.
He wasn't shy about crying.
Right. So something I've always been intrigued by is there was, unfortunately, a tradition of anti-Semitism among the British aristocracy. That was not the case with your grandfather. Your grandfather was very close to the Jewish community, which is, he knew how vicious Hitler was, what a vicious anti-Semite. I don't think he knew until later in the war about the Holocaust, because they were keeping it secret. But why did he have a different attitude than the aristocracy toward the Jewish community?
Well, I think he grew up in a family who were not at all anti-Semitic. His father had a lot of Jewish friends, so he grew up with that. And his first constituency had a big Jewish community.
Ah.
So, and basically, I mean, he wasn't at all biased in any way. From that point of view, he was all embracing. I mean, he also was good friends with Lawrence of Arabia. And so he wasn't one to judge that, and he didn't like injustice.
Exactly. Well, let me start asking some of the questions that the audience has. Are there any photos of the underground World War II headquarters that you used in your books or you've seen that are, is there large collections of it?
Of the war rooms, you mean?
Right, the war rooms.
I don't know. I haven't ever seen a photograph of it. I don't suppose anyone was allowed to take photographs of it
very
at that
interesting.
time.
This is an interesting question we discussed earlier. Would your grandfather have supported Brexit?
Well,
Now you're going to have to be a diplomat.
both the Leavers and the Remainers take him for their own, because there are elements in various speeches where people can say, yes, well, he said that we should be, friends with Europe, and on the other side, he was, of course, a friend of America. But on one occasion, he did draw 3 circles. One circle was Europe, one circle was Britain, and there was a big it was America. In the middle, there was a circle which was Britain, joining to both. But he was once asked, would you prefer Europe, would you rather be with Europe or in the deep blue sea? And he chose the deep blue sea, which I think was America. And his last words to his last cabinet meeting when he retired from office were, never be separated from America.
Very interesting. What piece of advice from your grandfather would you pass on to young people today? I have to tell a disturbing story. The polling data shows that 25% of young people in Britain, in Europe, Britain, and the United do not know what the Holocaust is, which I find extremely disturbing, I have to say. But they also don't know who Winston Churchill was. There is a large number. I mean, my children have no choice because at the dinner table I would pontificate about Churchill saving Western civilization twice, not just during the war, but when he gave the Iron Curtain speech. Too many people thought Uncle Joe Stalin was just some charming guy that we could trust, and he's the one.
And yet again, they didn't believe my grandfather, and they castigated him for that.
Yes, they did, but of course, within a few months, a couple of years, he was vindicated once again. So the memory of how close we came to defeat in the Second World War, it wasn't just a matter of the military defeat. What if Lord Halifax, who was the foreign minister under Chamberlain, and he was an appeaser. I actually think he was a pacifist for religious reasons, very devout Episcopalian Anglican, and but I shouldn't have been in office from my perspective. But tell us what would have happened if Lord Halifax had become prime minister, because the upper classes in Britain really liked Halifax.
Well, we have to thank the Lord for the fact that there was the House of Lords and that he was in the House of Lords.
Yes.
Otherwise, he certainly would have become prime minister.
Yes.
And, well, I don't know, certainly in Britain we'd be speaking German, and I think that if America couldn't have found a foothold in Britain, Hitler might have looked across the Atlantic too, because he wouldn't have been content just to have Europe, would he? And he'd have had Japan then. They could have done a pincer movement.
Well, we know in the German archives there was a plan to divide the United States between Japan and Germany when they invaded. But, I mean, there are lots of other people say the enormous power of the United States had never been awakened before in terms of a war like this war, and that there's no way Germany could have defeated the United States. But who knows? I think the argument you make, though, that we needed a base to launch the invasion of Europe was very true, very true.
But you know that Hitler, apparently the safest place in Britain was Blenheim Palace, because he decided that that was where he was going to live.
Is that right?
He wanted it for himself, so they weren't allowed to bomb it.
That is very interesting. I never heard that. So what advice would you give young people?
I'd give them the same advice that my grandfather gave when he went to his old school in the war. Never, 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 never give in.
Give in. In fact, that was the entire speech, wasn't it?
Not quite, but more or less.
More or less.
But people tend to say never give up, but he said never give in.
What leadership trait of Winston Churchill do you think is most important today, other than what you just said?
Courage.
Courage.
He used to say courage was the greatest of all human virtues, because if you don't have courage, you can't do anything. If you don't have courage, you don't believe in yourself, you can't do the things you need to do. You need courage to do absolutely anything.
Was your grandfather a supporter of the NATO alliance?
Oh, yes, he was, yes.
And the alliance system now is it's not crumbling, but it's under severe stress. And I wonder what your grandfather would say now, the risks to Western democracy, the Western democracies if NATO.
I think he'd be very disturbed by it.
I think so too. I think so too. Who was your grandfather's favorite American?
His favorite American? Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, his friend, one of his, I mean, he was his mentor. His first big friend was someone called Bert Cochran, who he met when on his first visit to America, and he was a friend of his mother's and an admirer of his mother's. And he became his mentor in speaking. And my grandfather said he taught me how to hold thousands in thrall. Well, he was being unusually modest because he eventually ended up holding millions in thrall. Yes. And then there was Bernard Baruch, who was his sort of last friend at the end.
Is that right? I did not know that. That's very interesting.
Bernard Baruch took him to the airport when he left for the last time to go back to his other country. 1961.
1961. Did your grandfather ever tell you what he thought of Stalin?
He never told me, no, but I don't think a lot. But he had to have this rather unpalatable alliance.
What did he say? He said something very amusing about the alliance with Stalin, I think, in the Parliament.
Yes, he said it was about the devil.
That's right.
Yes, and I can't
remember exactly.
Exactly, he said he would make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons.
Right.
It was about Stalin. You
Yes.
know. It was exactly. Anything's better than Hitler.
You mentioned your grandfather's painting. He's also a novelist, and his romantic.
He was recommended to his friends never to read it, though.
But they sold well, apparently.
It did sell. It was autobiographical, really.
Yeah. They said, several art critics said that if your grandfather did nothing but paint, he would be on the second tier of great British painters, in and of itself, apart from politics.
But if people think that he thought he was a politician, if he'd been asked what he was, he'd have said, I'm a writer. That was how he made his money. His children used to say, we live from pen to mouth.
What do you think of your grandfather would make of the pandemonium in the British Parliament these days, which seems to be out of character for Britain particularly? In the United States, we might do that, but not in Britain.
I don't think you do anything like that in the United States, do you? It's just awful. They are, I think there's no respect and no civility. When I grew up, there was the Labour Party and there was the Conservative Party. And the Labour Party, they were there to improve the lot of the working man. And the Conservatives were doing their duty for the country. And both of those ideals, very respectable, and both parties respected each other, and they all behaved in a very civil manner. But now, and then you eventually really mainly got a large area in the middle who all sort of got together. But now it's just horrible, and we've now got the right faction and the left faction. And so, I don't know. I think it's certainly a mess in Britain.
The problem is there's a mess here while there's a mess in Britain at the same time, which is very dangerous.
I have the idea of Corbyn and President Trump running the world, and that I think could be an interesting.
Can't quite imagine Corbyn being Prime Minister of Britain. However, he does not like the United States or the NATO alliance, and he likes Putin.
For me, that's my worst nightmare. I don't care about anything at the moment. It's the only thing that matters, that Corbyn doesn't become Prime Minister.
Could that happen, though?
It could. If you think how many votes he got at the last election and the election before, they managed to get social media, and they got into all the universities. They would have been bombarding Texas A&M if this had been Britain, and they got all the young votes. They said, you can get the vote at 16, no tuition fees, all loans will be paid, you can have all the loans paid off, everything you've done, no student loans, nothing to pay.
We have some people here who are saying, by the way, this would not go over too well at Texas A&M. This is a kind of a different university. But
So anyway, so that's what he would do. And if he got the vote for the 16-year-olds, they'd be in forever.
They wouldn't vote, that's the problem. Anyway,
Oh, they never know.
Anyway, thank you very much for visiting, and there will be you'll give another talk at the Bush School, and we have closed it off, so if you haven't signed up, there'll be a different talk, though.
It will be a different talk.
Right.
It's about his leadership and his speeches.
Right.
And he'll be speaking.
He will be speaking. Okay.
I'm bringing him with me to speak.
Okay. Good. Thank you all for coming.